Hi, Ian.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to be with you again and finally have you on your show. You're my first guest in 2 years.
I'm honoured to
Thank
be,
you.
the start of a new batch, hopefully, the first of many.
I don't do it when I'm making movies. Thankfully, I've been busy on movies for 2 years, so that's why. This was an important show because I'm a huge fan of your writing. I'm a massive fan of now your documentary filmmaking. For those who don't know much about you, tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew
Okay.
up.
All right. I think you can hear from my accent that I'm not American. I was born just outside London, a place called Guildford. I grew up in a town called High Wickham, which again is not far from London. It's about 25 minutes outside of London. Very normal childhood, a grammar school. It's the 80s when I was a sort of a teenager, completely movie obsessed since, and that comes from my parents who, I grew up, I'm sure you're similar, but there was very few channels on TV where I grew up. When I grew up, it was three basically. It wasn't even VHS. It was that in the dark ages. So when a bank holiday or a public holiday would come along in Britain, it was often you got the Bond films or you got like Ben-Hur, you got something. And my parents had this gift of building that up for me, going, guess what? Monday we're all going to watch Doctor No. Yeah, it was so exciting to me. And that sort of then translated into going to the cinema. Yeah, obviously I started with, like every kid does, with the Disneys and those things. But my dad was very good at introducing me to bigger movies. Close Encounters was my first Spielberg. We may have already spoken about that. Star Wars, I saw at the cinema at the age of 7. Down to my dad queuing up for tickets, and we saw it in the Odeon Leicester Square in London. It became a ritual after that, that going to the films was part of what I did and who I was. Bond films every summer or every winter, depending on what the schedule was of the Bond film. And then as I grew older, a little bit, my taste broadened, into kind of watching horror films when I could get into them. A familiar pattern. I got into international cinema, the sense of what movies could do. So a broad spectrum. But when you grow up in the 80s, you go to school in the 80s, there's never like a file in the kind of careers office that says film journalist or film critic. No one thinks that's a real job. It was all kind of engineer or scientist or doctor or lawyer, the classic things. So I went to study environmental biology. I was a bit confused about what I really wanted to do and fell into that a little bit. It was about halfway through my course, and it really dawned on me that I was terrible at experiments. I was bad at the math, and the only thing I was any good at was writing the essays because I could really. I was confident on the page, whereas I wasn't in practical terms. About halfway through, as I was saying, I went to see the careers officer at it was Cardiff University, and I don't remember this woman's name, but she actually changed my life. I don't even remember her name, so she has no idea, and she may have changed a lot of people's lives, and I hope so. But I went in and I said, "Look, I'm struggling. I don't think I can do science," and we sort of got talking. She said, "Well, if you're good at the writing, how about scientific publishing? There's a whole world where you don't actually do experiments, but you publish books and papers and all those things. You work on that side of it." And that seemed certainly more positive than what I was doing. And as a big reader, books always made sense to me. And then she made this incredible suggestion. She said, "Well, to get some experience, why don't you join the student newspaper?" I said, "Well, you just get a hang of what it's like to work with words and publishing and printing. But without committing, it's a really sort of good way of getting in your sense of that." So I went to the student newspaper that very afternoon, and it was at the top of our student union we used to have. I don't know if you have them in America, but they're kind of the buildings where the bars and all the kind of student stuff is, all these meeting rooms. But the actual newspaper office was the top of this building. And I went all the way up, and as I walked along the corridor to where the office was, a door slammed ahead of me, and a guy with a kind of very elaborately earringed and shaven head. I may be mythologizing this a bit, but I remember tattoos, and he stormed out and almost pushed past me. Now, again, I might be embellishing this because he may not, but I like the story. And I thought clearly something had happened. And when I walked into the office, there was an atmosphere. But I'd come all this way, and I was determined. And I was introduced to the editor, and he was looking harried. And I learned later that he and this guy had fallen out over a girl. I don't know which girl that is, but she also changed my life indirectly. And I said, "Look, I'm really interested in helping out. These are things, kind of what can I do? Can I tell any stories? And he just said, "Look, can you help me out? I've just lost my entertainment's editor. He's just stormed out the door. Can you simply look after it for a couple of weeks?" And I said, "Okay." And in some senses, I'm still there. And in some ways, I sat down at that desk and I'm still at that desk because that was my career. And I kind of farmed out the kind of dance and theatre and music to people who were already writing about those things, knew more about them than me. But I knew my film. And I went, right, film is mine. And I learned that you went to press screenings at the local cinemas and just thought something clicked in me that I'd never had to that point. I suppose I was 17, maybe. A will, a determination kicked in that this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to find a way to do it. I'm going to write about film. I'm going to make money from this. I don't know what the path is yet. And my parents thought I was mad. In fact, they still kind of not sure I've got a proper job. They're like, you make money from that? Are you sure you shouldn't be doing something else? They've just about got the hang of it now, but filmmaker makes sense to them. Books made sense to them. But for a long time, they were very confused. And then cut a very long story short. As I left university, I started making contacts. I met them while I was there. I got to know a little bit about working for local newspapers. And I got to learn through some very kind people who helped me out what the London film journalist scene was, where screenings happened and how you got into them, and began to meet people. Gradually, my kind of portfolio, if you want to call it that, I certainly didn't at the time, but the number of people I was writing for and the magazines I got into, I was very wise to go for magazines that were new, because I thought they haven't yet established their teams yet. Magazines that were kind of really old were kind of full of seasoned writers who aren't going to budge for some young. So I kind of rather wisely, and I don't know how I came up with that thought, but I did come up with that thought. Gradually got into places where I learned also that people tend to employ you if you can help them out. They don't employ you for the good of your health or for the art of what you do. If they can see you can write and you've already seen something and you can get a review in and they've got a page to fill and that you solve a problem, they like you. And then they come back to you to carry on solving their problems, because life on a magazine is hell and hassle. And all you want is for it to be easier, and more convenient. So I learned very quickly about be available, be on time, write to length. I did break that rule a few times. Be a good journalist. Don't be all full of yourself, because that's why people come back to you. And during that period, Empire magazine, which had already established itself as the leading film magazine in Britain, it was really on the up and up. So it timed itself with the rise of multiplexes. Q magazine was Empire's sort of sister magazine. That was sort of developed on the back of the CD. It all sounds so antiquated now. So Empire was based on the rise of multiplexes, that you had choice. On a Friday night, there wasn't just one film playing at the local cinema. There was 8 or 10. And this changed the way we perceived film. We could choose what was our kind of film out of these choices. And this became the ethos of Empire. Anyway, a job came up, a staff writer job. I may have exaggerated my CV a little bit, made myself sound more experienced and more important than I am. But they gave me the job. Again, another place I got my fingernails in, because it was my kingdom. It was where I belonged. And it was really hard work, full of ups and downs, but a phenomenal part of my life. I eventually became editor and executive editor. I stayed there for about 22 years. I traveled the world. I went on movie sets. I met people I couldn't have dreamed of meeting when I was young. But I learned about, the important thing isn't meeting people. It's about telling their story. And it's about translating that for the viewer. I tell this story a lot, but one of my first few days on Empire, by chance, I went on a conference with the mag. They have the kind of annual conferences to talk about the future of the mag. I was taken along a bit, not knowing a lot. And the publisher, who had this kind of way of, talking about things, but he'd launched Empire. He's a very, very clever man. He sort of pointed at me as the new boy and went, "Is Empire a film magazine?" And I thought, this strangest question to ask. Of course it is, movie stars. And I went, yes. Kind of knowing there was a trap here. And he went, "You're wrong." He said, "It's a magazine about movie going." That stays with me. What that meant was the ethos of what we wrote and how we wrote it was about people who went to the movie on a Friday night out of joy and pleasure of watching them. We weren't people who lived in Hollywood and hung out with George Clooney. We weren't people who, were part of the scene or even the industry. We were people who understood what it was to just love to go and watch films and talk about them. And I think that was such a key lesson, and in everything I write and the documentaries I make, all the pieces of the journalism I still do occasionally, that stays with me. It's not about being somebody you're not. It's about the fact that I'm a fan. Guy who watched Dr. No with his parents and Raiders of the Lost Ark with his mum. And I, sulked all day until she took me because I was just a weird kid. Cried through E.T. and my mum took me to Gandhi because she thought it was important I saw Gandhi. All those things, all those incredible experiences. That's who I was. I wasn't George Clooney's mate, and I was never going to be George Clooney's mate. I've interviewed George Clooney. He's a lovely, lovely man and a great interview, but we don't exchange Christmas cards. It was another, again, the same publisher had a very good way of saying it. He said, "They're never going to be your friend." So it doesn't mean you don't get on. It just means keep your head on you. You know, it's about the piece you write, it's about the publication, it's about the story you're telling, not about making friends. And I think a lot of journalists make that mistake. They want to go in and win them over. Yeah, you go in and you want to be nice and pleasant, enjoy the process. I've recently interviewed Kurt Russell for The Thing Expanded. It's not like Kurt and I went out, for dinner afterwards and carried on talking. He was terrific, yeah, and I had a great time, and I'm really pleased with how it fits into the documentary. But that was my job, and that was his job. That I think is vitally important. Again, just to squeeze the end bit, I spent 22 years at Empire. Began writing books in that time. I really wanted to, for very complicated reasons. I felt my time at Empire was done. Digital had come in, and it was a confused time in the publishing industry. And I felt I wasn't the only one, but I felt that our publishing company didn't have a proper strategy for the internet. Struggled with that, so built up my sort of extracurricular side, books. That took off. About 5 years ago, about 6 years ago, I was interviewed as a talking head for a documentary called The Last Action Heroes, about the 80s action movies and the Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme nexus. The guy called Robin Block, who was the head of the company that produced that documentary, stayed in touch with me. And I did another couple of talking head gigs. And then he took me out to lunch about 4 years ago. Said, "Do you want to make a documentary?" And I said, "Are you sure? I've never done this before." He said, "Exactly. I know you can tell the story. The rest of it you'll learn. It'll be tough, but you'll learn it, because I believe you have the ability to, get the message over." He's right on both counts. And he had this idea called Expanded, which was about taking a single film that's beloved and a certain genre complexion, horror, sci-fi, together is what seems to work. Getting the fans to back it, an extraordinary process in itself. And then we would take the film and we'd break it down by sequence, the whole chronology of the film, and explore what makes it great, and just try and find out.
So before we go any further, covered a lot of my questions, which is amazing. I got into
Yeah,
writing a little differently than you. There's no right or wrong way to do that, obviously.
of course.
My situation was, I remember back in, I don't know if it was either elementary or middle school, I would make comic books with a friend of mine named Andrew Crapella. So my writing as a writer started making comic books, for ourselves. Obviously, they didn't
Yeah,
go out to the world. As I got into middle school, I started writing stories.
yeah,
I like to write creative stories. Like they weren't movie scripts, they weren't magazine reviews or anything like that. And then as I got into high school, I'd started reading Fangoria
yeah,
magazine. I didn't read it from the first issue. My first issue was 24 with Extra, which was made in England, as you know, from
yeah,
Harry Bromley Davenport. So I read that John Carpenter had a fanzine as a boy, and that's how he got in before he made movies. And since Carpenter was the guy that kind of started my interest in film with Halloween and later The Thing, I decided to make my own fanzine. So I made this fanzine, which, was typed, was before
yeah.
computers,
Oh, yeah,
and it was called Carnage because I like scary movies the most.
yeah, yeah,
So Carnage meaning death and gore and blood and stuff. So what I do is I'd write reviews of movies, which I was either watching in a theater or HS had started at that point, cable. And then I recruited other friends to write reviews of either movies, books, they create their own short stories.
yeah,
And then we'd all draw too. We'd do artwork. And I'd even recruit the best artists in my area. And I got some guys that were really talented, like Tim Brunn. So Carnage we put out in high school, I would say the last 2 or 3 years of my high school. Then we started sending them out to people throughout the United States because as Fangoria did, they'd have these little personal ads at the back where you could, Michael Myers fan, Halloween, Dawn of the Dead.
yeah.
And we'd start putting these little ads out and we didn't get a lot of people to read it, but people would read it. And I was the editor and I was the main writer. So
Yeah.
that's how I started getting my writing. Writing's tough. I mean, I ended up writing later for Shockwave magazine, for Metal Edge magazine, fearsmag.com. I had my own website for many years. I wrote my own reviews. I've written thousands and thousands of reviews, but I think what's good about it for me, I'm not sure about you, Ian,
Yeah.
how you try to get better as a
Oh,
writer.
yeah.
Just not just the words, but the way you would talk, the way you express. When I look back to some of that early stuff, kind of laugh at it because
I know
you're
me.
not that good, right? When you start out,
Yeah.
right? How do you feel about that?
Oh, completely. I completely agree. You never stop learning. Your next thing is your best thing in your head, whether it turns out that way or not, but it's always the one that's going to be better. You do, yeah, I look back on some of my early stuff. Some of it's all right, but some of it's a bit embarrassing. And it's like, occasionally I do talks for sort of students who want to know, they want to know how to get into writing and all those things. And I say, look, on one level, it is, of course, an art and it's about you and all those things are true, but beware of thinking too much of that way. And I say it's practical. If you keep writing and keep reading, I say you've got to keep reading because it's like training. It's like, if you're going to be an athlete, you've got to run, you've got to train. If you're going to be a writer, you've got to read. If you're not reading, you're not a good writer. But also it's about experimenting and it's about, I used to dive at my high high school. We had a big pool opposite us in the big sports centre, and we had this opportunity to dive. It wasn't that great, but I did it for a few years. And the thing about diving, it's about what you don't do. It's not about what you do. It's about learning not to do things, allowing the body just to be, arc and be great, gravity take hold. I mean, once you get very good, you have to learn to do things again. But the basis of diving is sort of shedding your fears and shedding what your potential to kind of make it go wrong. And I think writing is a little bit like that. Writing is it's about almost stopping yourself doing things. If you hear yourself talk, it's often a lot more fun and a lot more interesting than the way a lot of people write. Because I don't know, it's like you're still writing to grandma to say thanks for your Christmas present, because it's always really formal. For writing, I think it's a lot about stripping away what you think are the rules and getting your personality out. And of course, filling your head with information and expertise. One rule of writing is know what you're going to write about, know it. There's no excuses for that. There's no way around it. You have to have a knowledge in your head that you're trying to convey. And if it's not there, it's just wasted words. So absolutely. But I never think I've got it. I always think I'm still struggling.
Do you like to write listening to music, or do you like complete silence?
I've gone back to silence. For a long time, I did try music. I find myself, I'm easily distracted. So I can't do podcasts. Yeah, because I just start listening to the podcast. I'm not. But at times I do a little bit of music. I know Stephen King, he plays heavy metal, doesn't he, famously?
Yeah.
And I thought, God, how do you concentrate? But maybe it's about drowning out your own doubt. A lot of writing is about getting over yourself in terms of that little voice in your head going, that's not good enough. No one cares. And again, that plagued me. It plagues me right through my documentary filmmaking. It plagues me with every book. The little voice going, everybody knows this already. It's really boring. Why bother? And of course, you realize every writer has that voice in their head. I'm sure Nabokov did and Salinger did, that, brilliant as they are. And that's the journey of writing, is that it's never to be satisfied, never to be content. Although I do get a little bit of pleasure, and I don't know if you feel the same, that I read pieces I've forgotten I wrote from a few years ago. They sort of come up. I've got everything on my hard drive. I go back and something, and you go, because you've forgotten writing it, and you read it almost like it wasn't written by you, and you're like, that's all right. All right. You were better then. You get into a bit of...
For me, writing the reviews, I never found it particularly hard. I'm not saying I was good at it. I tried
Yeah.
to be good at it. Was there anyone that you read as a journalist that inspired you to write? There was a guy for me early on.
Yeah.
I didn't know him personally. He
Yeah.
was a guy named Donald Farmer. Put out
Okay.
this low budget horror. I don't know if you want to call it fanzine. I think it's a little above that, called The Splatter Times. And I believe he was from Tennessee or Kentucky, one of those states.
Right.
And I didn't know him. It was before internet. There was no email at that time in the 80s. But I remember it seemed like he knew so much about movies. And it wasn't just the regular movies. He knew the really deep exploitation movies and also European cinema, worldwide
Yeah.
cinema. And I always yearned to have that kind of broad knowledge and to cover that kind of ground. But he wrote kind of complex. He wasn't
Yeah.
afraid to talk about the darker aspects of those movies in a way that seemed appealing to me. Was there someone like that for you?
And not quite as specific. I really did want to be good. So I started reading a lot of people I thought I should read. I read a lot of Pauline Kael. And I thought, God, how can I even begin to want to get this? I remember the first time I read Martin Amis. I read a novel. I read London Fields, his first novel. I thought I grew up in one book read. I was just electrified by what language could do. There was a critic, I think he's recently retired from New Yorker, called Anthony Lane, who's the New Yorker, you may know him. Just had a wonderful lightness. This lightness of touch that never denied his intelligence or how profound he could be, but an open-mindedness as well. Very funny. I mean, I always, again, something when people ask you what's good writing, I say, don't forget humor. Humor is really hard on the page. You don't have tone. You can't do the funny voice. So you have to create it on a page. It's so hard to do. I think it's such a great skill. If you can be very serious about your subject, but also funny in a way that almost makes it more serious. Brilliant thing. Anthony Lane could do that. He had a brilliant. He once wrote a piece about his great hero is a writer called P.G. Wodehouse, comic writer from Britain. Weaves in Jeeves and Wooster. I should get that out of my head. Butler and Poshman, but incredibly funny book. And Lane modelled his style on P.G. Wodehouse. And he wrote this story for the New Yorker about an uncle who first introduced him to P.G. Wodehouse, and it was about 5,000 words long. And it may be the single greatest article I've ever read. For 1,000 words, he doesn't even mention P.G. Wodehouse. And you realize just how, I mean, to get 5,000 words to write is a great gift. Some of us have 40 words to write. But I just felt I knew him, I knew P.G. Wodehouse, I knew his family, it's all about this uncle. Felt something about myself, what I liked and how I wanted to engage with people. I don't know you, but when I read and when I try and write, is you want to bring an immediacy of experience. So when I write about film, I write about what it's like to watch that film or those films or that person, what it's like, because that's a shared thing. So when I watch the thing, these are my feelings and these are my experiences. Hopefully you connect with people that way. They go, oh yeah, because that's how I felt. If you're writing about great films, then that really helps. At Empire, you would have to give some things a kicking, and that could get you. That gets a different kind of world to get into, but still fun. But yeah, I love to bring out that sort of sense of immediate experience, or try and get to it. Films are, it's a sensory thing. We sit there and we let them fall upon us. To translate that is hard.
I love how you brought up the serious with humor. I think that relates to the movie I'm making right now. Maybe even a little bit of some of the other movies. So obviously I went from writing as a journalist for
Yeah,
my own magazine, and I wrote for the school newspaper. And when I was in the Army, I wrote for the Army newspaper a little bit. And, some other magazines after that. Guitar 2001 magazine, which is
yeah.
heavy metal guitar players. I was a senior writer for 6 years
Oh
because I'm a
wow.
big heavy metal guy. As a film director, which, this is my 40th anniversary this year. So
Yeah,
I started making movies in 1986 when I was in the Army. And I've written most of the films I've made. There have been a few
yeah,
that I've written, that I've directed for other writers, very few. What I've found on my new movie especially, I had a goal to make a slasher film. I know that's not why we're here to talk today, but it relates to what we're saying.
yeah,
I grew up during the slasher craze, so I understand those movies as good as anyone in the world. From 78 to really 84, between, Carpenter's Halloween and Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street, and all those movies in between,
yeah,
Graduation Day, My Bloody Valentine, Prom Night, Terror Train, etc. So I lived through that time when they came out in the theater, cable, VHS. When I decided to make a slasher movie 2 Decembers ago, what was wild, Ian, was I had just finished directing two movies over about 5 months. They were two
right.
horror anthology movies, Begin at the End in August of 2024 and AI in December of 24. Soon as I was done with AI, I was like, I want to write a slasher film.
Yeah,
And I want to make it about a female killer. Do you know that it came to me so strong? I wrote that entire script, 127-page script, 34 characters, 44 locations in 30 days. What I was trying to relate to what you were talking about, I didn't want it to be just serious. I wanted there to be some humor.
yeah,
But it's a serious movie. It's not a hokey, it's not a
yeah,
comedy, it's not a campy movie. So when I was writing that, I wanted to combine kind of My Bloody Valentine and Halloween with like Porky's, Bob Clark's
yeah,
Porky's. I wanted that mix. And I think I've achieved it. We're in post right now in the film. When I look at the movie, characters and what they say and how they present themselves, I'm really proud of it because we've got that duality of humor and seriousness, drama, suspense, mystery. There's some gore and stuff like that as well. But if you're expecting a Friday 13th like clone, like a
yeah.
one-note, pedestrian, generic guy with a mask killing people out of sex, that's not what this movie is. So hopefully as a writer, I achieved that. But
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Did you see Weapons? The director of Weapons, he'd come from a comedy background, and he treads that line. He knowingly does funny things in a very serious horror movie, and
yeah,
it's right on the edge. You can feel the film sort of teetering into absurdity, but he holds it back. The kids chasing her at the end and all that stuff. It's laughable, and he knows it's laughable. And he thinks, and I like that. I remember, maybe we've talked about this before, but when my mum saw Alien and I couldn't go because I was too young, and she saw Alien, and I was very angry about this. And the next morning, I demanded to know all about sci-fi film, and I had to see sci-fi film. And she said it was so scary, people laughed. And when you're 9 years old, you don't quite understand what that means. What she was talking about was hysteria, that the only outlet when something is so shocking was you just have to sort of laugh to get your grip on yourself. And that's such a great thing. It's such a powerful thing that horror and humor run very close to each other in your brain, the two kind of impulses. The Thing has moments in it which are very funny. And I know Carpenter is conscious of that and plays that. The death of Windows is wacky. It is, and it's knowingly wacky. The Spiderhead is a wacky, funny thing. That way of containing the two things.
I think if I was to boil it down even to the most simplistic of
Yeah,
thoughts, it's okay to enjoy watching a movie. One of the problems I had with what they call the Eli Roth period What was
Oh
that?
yeah, the torture porn
Torture
kind of,
porn. One of the
yeah.
things I didn't like about torture porn is it wasn't fun. You didn't enjoy just seeing people get killed. I mean, some people might enjoy that, but I didn't enjoy where just there was no other side to it.
Yeah, yeah.
I could enjoy parts of that for what it is, but it doesn't have to be just black as black. Times you can let off a little bit to let the audience have a little breather. I think it's okay to do that. Do you agree?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. And to sort of share something with the audience. I mean, if you think about like the Final Destination movies, which I think are great, yeah, and they always know what their remit is, but it's a shared joke with the
Yeah.
audience about you think it's going to be that? No, 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 it's going to be this, and here's how we're going to do it. It's like a long joke, isn't it? They start building the parts of the death
Yeah.
really early on until bam, it happened, and it is funny. It's kind of like horrible and shocking, but very funny, and I think that's really clever, and it's a really sort of the wrong word, but affectionate way of making films. It's like you're sharing that with the kind of audience. They're going, yeah, we're really serious about this, but I'm kind of with you, and you're with me, and we know this is kind of funny too.
Yeah, look at the Terminator. I know it's not necessarily a
Yeah.
horror film, but I'll be back. I mean, just all these little, not just the dialogue, but the moments. There's some funny, and that's a serious action science
Yeah,
fiction fantasy film, right?
totally. Yeah, and Cameron knew that. I mean, as soon as he cast Schwarzenegger, I think Cameron knew he had a black comedy, he had a sci-fi film and a horror film, and a film modeled on Halloween very carefully. I think he knew, and he had that accent. He sounds like an answer phone, and he sounds like a machine, so he's
And,
got to
and,
be funny.
and look at Aliens. You
Yeah,
betch, get away from her. You bet.
yeah,
That's funny too, right? And it's a serious, horrific horror
yeah.
science fiction film, right?
It's about Cameron called it the kind of pressure valve.
Yes.
Every time Hudson speaks in Aliens, it's about releasing a bit of the pressure to give the audience a break, but not too much. Then
Yeah.
tighten up again. So here we are, let off a bit of steam because Hudson said, "Game over, man." Well, we all laugh. Then, whoa, you're not going to let you go that far, and bam, we're straight back into it. It almost makes things worse because you're recovered for a little bit, and then you're thrown back into it again.
When you started authoring your books, what was your first one? I've read a bunch of them. What was
Yeah.
your first one, and how did you choose that? Or was that the publisher giving you a movie to go?
Yeah, they chose me a little bit. I think I'd done some pitches along the way and hadn't been very successful. Still heavily involved in Empire, so didn't really have the time. This year, a contact, someone who I had worked with the same publishing company as Empire, had moved on to a French publishing company based in London. He knew that the head of film books there was looking to do a Coen Brothers book. They did very kind of short, almost like they're called monographs. So they're quick hits. I think it's about 20,000 words, not even that, maybe 18,000 words on the films of the Coen Brothers. I'm a huge Coen Brothers fan, as I'm sure we've talked about. Did a proposal and did the book, overwrote by about 5,000 words, had to cut 5,000 words out of it. Learned that they don't, the thing with publishing is they have a set amount of pages and they've told you amount of pages and you stick to it. So that was my first one. Then Alien Vault came along, and then that came through Empire. The publisher called the office and got hold of my colleague, another Ian Freer, and they said, "Oh, we're looking for somebody who does Alien." And he went, "You're talking to the wrong Ian," and put them through to me. He said, "This is the guy for Alien," and I picked up the call and they said, "Can you do this?" And I went, "Totally." And Alien Vault was the first sort of major book that I did. And Terminator Vault happened off the back of Alien Vault. And then I always say this, books kind of beget books. As soon as you sort of start doing it, if they do all right, the publisher wants to keep going with you. And also, once you publish books, you can sort of talk to other publishers and other things sort of happen. There is a kind of cumulative effect with being a book writer that, as long as you can do it, as long as you can keep up with it and find your way, because they are heavy workloads. And if you stop and do your hourly rate, you'll just go mad. You'll just, and it's a bit like films as well. You work so many hours, you can't go, what is a sensible way of making money here? They're not. There's a long tail on them. You have residuals and you have royalties. And what happens is, certain books of mine have done very well and they pay me every year. So every year I get not life-changing money, but you get a good amount of money. So that makes it very satisfying.
What's the usual length it takes you to write a book? I know it depends on the page count or the
Yeah.
word count. What's a normal average, like what does that look like for the people out there that don't know how long it takes to write a book?
Most of my books have been in a series called Iconic Filmmakers, and I've also done a series of retrospective books. So Iconic Filmmakers is about 30,000 words, and the retrospectives are about 45 to 50. So the James Cameron book that you read, that was a retrospective. I think it's about 50,000 words, that one. The Iconic Filmmaker series, which are kind of film by film sort of take on certain directors. They run about 35, 30, 35. When it was Spielberg, I pushed for 40 and got it because I've been doing a lot of books. Part of the issues, again, there's always practical things behind publishing. It was a commercial enterprise. They're not there to indulge my art. They're there to sell books. They obviously want good books. So hopefully they'll sell more. A book has to be, you make a lot of money from foreign sales with a book. So translation to French and Spanish and Japanese and in a lot of different languages. And to translate a book costs money. So the more words, the more it costs to translate. So there are practical elements. The more paper you use, the more expensive the book is, the more it costs to print and to make. There is a discipline in you can only have this many words. And it's not there because people are trying to stop you doing what you want to do. It's because that's the deal. That's the kind of the financial deal that makes it work. Films can't all be 10 hours long. Even if you've got a 10-hour story, it won't work. People won't sit down and watch it. I am making 5-hour documentaries at the moment, but I'm not sure they're meant to be watched all in one go unless that's what you want to do. But yeah, so there is a pragmatic element to writing. And then usually I get, say for an iconic filmmakers series like I did Wes Anderson and Quentin Tarantino and Steven Spielberg, I get roughly about 6 to 8 months on those. Usually, they are people I know about. So there's been like a lifetime of watching all those films and knowing about those film directors. It's not like I arrived to these subjects without knowing anything. I'm sort of cold. Oh my God, what's Alien? What's this film? I knew all there was to know about Alien. Well, I thought I did. When I went to write Alien Vault, I was already in that place. And that's probably a quality I have as a writer, is that I watch a lot of films, but I'm very immersed in the idea of talking about film and writing about film. Most suggestions make sense to me and I can go with them. Certain books have taken longer. I wrote a book about the making of Lord of the Rings called Anything You Can Imagine. It was a much bigger book and involved a lot of interviews and my time on set and all these things. Now it's like 120,000 words long. So a biggie. That took me about a year and a half to write. But also, there'd been all the time writing I'd done on Lord of the Rings before that accumulated. So it's an organic thing. But deadlines are important. Again, if someone's listening out there and thinking about being a writer, it's not necessarily this idea of you have all this time in the world, you can just write over years. Some writers, if they're hugely successful, get that. Great novelists can spend 10 years on a book. George R. Martin seems to be spending the rest of his life on writing the next Game of Thrones novel, but he has that power and has that financial security. But most publishing is quite practical, and you probably get a set amount of time, which is usually under a year. You have to get going. You have to gallop and really kind of get into the process of it.
Pivoting over to the documentaries,
Yeah.
Aliens Expanded. Did the publisher choose that movie to do the expanded, or did you propose that?
It was funny. We had the lunch in which Robin had presented this idea of me making a documentary, talked about his expanded format. And he said, what film would you do it with? Hypothetical. And I went, Aliens. And he said, great, because I want it to be Aliens. And
wow.
It was kind of really a bit uncanny. And it's really interesting because I think both of us understood something. Because the question you might ask is, why didn't you do Alien? First one, it's a masterpiece. It's so influential. It changed the genre. Enormously important film. But it was about something about the expanded format. It was also about fandom, passion of fans for a film. Aliens offered more in that sense, that it's much more of a friend to people as a movie than Alien is. I think we hold Alien in a sense of awe, and there's a magnificence there that can always be written about and talked about, and I'm sure more documentaries have been made about it. Aliens just gave the expanded format something. We loved these characters, we loved their company. Hudson and Hicks and Vasquez and Drake. We loved being with them. Even we knew, watching it endlessly, their fate, was sealed in many cases. It didn't matter. Ripley was so important to us in so many different ways. That kind of personality that Aliens had was something we wanted to tune into. That was part of the expanded idea. It was about the relationship the fan has with a film. And that's true of The Thing as well. Very different film to Aliens, but there is a sort of sense of warmth in a cold climate with The Thing. Although those guys are often quite difficult to get on with, they're difficult guys and they're not getting on with each other, certainly. We kind of love them as well. We love Bennings, we love Blair. And of course we love McCready. McCready lives on, and he's one of the great movie lead characters. In highfalutin terms, they call it a parasocial relationship. You have a sort of genuine psychological friendship with fictional characters. And it doesn't mean you're bonkers, and it doesn't mean you don't know what's real and what isn't real. It's just how the work of art affects you. And I think that's brilliant. I think it's kind of wonderful. Maybe with the exception of Ripley in the original Alien and Jones the Cat, I don't know if we had that quite. Alien is a 70s movie. It's about complicated things. Aliens had this nice touch of 80s-ness in that these guys were cool.
Yeah.
They were full of hubris. They really, they really got the situation wrong, but they were wonderful. We knew them within seconds, didn't we? As soon as they wake up on the Sulaco, we know Apone and we know Drake and we know Hudson. It just takes beats, to get them.
I may even add, and this may sound sacrilegious to some, is
Yeah,
I think that Aliens, and I'm not really a big fan of necessarily always sequels
yeah,
or especially reboots or remakes, which I think is stupid. I think it's the greatest sequel ever made. And I think that Aliens also is it's an easier movie to watch. Aliens, it's dark I mean, Alien is dark and it's cold and it's wet and it's nasty. And this other one's got like Marines and fighting and all these kind of one-line funny scenes. And even Bishop versus Ash is a different
yeah, yeah,
personality. Cameron's effects background and his ability to bring in all these other visual guys, maybe where the industry had grown, he was able to show the mother, he was able to
yeah,
show all these different, I mean, he just took it to a different level. And in my opinion, I like it more as a movie. I like both, but
yeah.
I'm a bigger fan of Aliens than even Alien.
I get frustrated with the bests, in these
I know it's
lists.
hard. It's hard.
And I'm greedy. I want them both.
Yeah.
I want to have them both, and they're both for me, and they're both important to me, and they're both brilliant. I think in interconnected ways and separate ways. I think you're absolutely right. I think Cameron sort of perfected the art of the sequel. He did it also with T2, but maybe Aliens is the one. The same but different. Why people don't study Aliens and Terminator 2 is the rules for the sequel game. He brilliantly inverts things from the original. He understands, if you watch Aliens very closely, it mirrors the beats of Alien. It has this kind of format where he plays things at the same time. 45 minutes without much happening in terms of action. And suddenly the action, the hive, and the chest burster, he parallels things. You mentioned Bishop. Bishop's trajectory is the exact opposite of Ash's. They're a
Yeah.
mirror image. Ash goes from, we think he's human, turns out to be a robot. Bishop is, we know he's a robot, but he becomes more human.
Human.
We come to love him. He's got a heart. Brilliant. It's just a simple concept. I've got to have a synthetic character because we're carrying on a theme, but I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it in a way that reflects what Ash is, but do it completely different. And the audience sort of, both they're surprised by it and they're thrilled because it sort of appeals to their sense of what they already know. It's like, I get it. You understand I've seen Alien and and really had a good time with Alien and really love it. And you're playing on that love in a different way. And I think he's so good at that, second to none. His ability to just understand what the sequel can be as a concept, turning Arnie into a good guy in Terminator 2.
Oh,
And what a risk. Everything that the original was about was, the machine killing, the
yeah.
machine killer. And then the second one, you turn, again, it's a bit like Bishop. You give him a heart, follow that line. Everyone doubted that. When he delivered his script, I think Schwarzenegger was going, they're going to laugh at me. This isn't cool. Studio are like, are you sure? It's a bit sentimental, isn't it? Can't we just do more of the same? He went, this is what I want to do. And of course, now we look at Terminator 2 as, one of the great sort of movie epics. We talked about this before, but Cameron is such a brilliant filmmaker. Setting aside his technical abilities and his ability to kind of forge new ways of making films, his gifts of storytelling visually and sort of orally and just in terms of structure are just fabulous.
I've always said, because The Terminator is one of my three favorite films, the
Yeah.
first one. I've always said he seems to be smarter than everybody else because he knows what the audience wants and how to deliver that. As good as anyone else is, they can't match those things that he makes so important and then his ability to deliver that. It's uncanny, one of a kind. Like I just saw, maybe a month ago, the third Avatar. See it when it first came out. I just waited for it to kind of die down.
Yeah.
And someone asked me, how was this 3 hour and 15-minute movie? You kind of know what's going to happen. And I said, it was absolutely brilliant. And I said, he delivers on every single aspect of it. There's nobody else that can do what he does. He's one of a kind. It's insane because we're so lucky to have him. I mean, obviously we've got other great filmmakers, but there's something about him. But let's go to Carpenter here for a second because I know that's probably the foundation of why we're having this thing.
And Cameron's favorite filmmaker, by the way, and Cameron talks about this. He goes, the guy I learned the most from was John Carpenter.
Absolutely. And isn't it interesting? Those are two of my three favorite filmmakers. Yeah. For me, it's Carpenter, Cameron, and Michael Mann. In 1982, it opened up in June of 82. I went open opening weekend. I did not go opening night. I was a high school. Obviously, I didn't have a lot of money. So I went
Yeah.
the next day on Saturday at the matinee. So I saw John Carpenter's The Thing. I think it was June 26th if it opened up 25th. What was weird for me, Ian, was I'd seen Halloween 4 years before this, right? As a
Yeah.
13-year-old boy in a theater. It scared the shit out of me. And at the time, I knew that I wanted to get involved in filmmaking, but I didn't know how and not even what. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a director. I'm going to be a writer. First, I thought it was effects because at the
Yeah.
time, even though Halloween was kind of an effects-free film, at the time you had Dick Smith doing, Altered States, or Rick Baker doing American Werewolf, and Tom Savini doing Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th, etc. So at first I thought my interest was effects. But then when I went and saw The Thing opening weekend, I was blown away by the movie. Not just because of Rob Bottin's effects or the music by Morricone or Carpenter as well, or the cinematography by Dean Cundy, or those Albert Whitlock matte paintings, or
Yeah.
all these other things that were so incredible. When I walked out, I looked up at the poster. I just watched the movie. It didn't hit me when I was in the theater. It was actually afterwards. And I looked up at the poster and I said, wait a second. That's the same guy that made Halloween. And it was that very second I said, I have to do what he did to me twice. And I decided, I didn't know anything about directing. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I actually decided and have been obsessed with directing since that day. So how did you see The Thing originally,
Yeah.
and what impact had it even before you decided to do this documentary?
I saw The Thing on VHS. I was 15. I don't know if you had them in American schools, but we had a thing called a sports day, which meant everybody has to kind of, run a race or do something. Sports day, it was me and a couple of friends. We played hooky. We just played hooky from sports day. And one of these friends of mine, his dad had this miraculous thing called a video recorder. We didn't really know, we'd heard about them, but they were still enormously expensive and very few people. His dad clearly got hold of one. And again, I think video stores had just started opening. And as we got there, and his house was empty, and he said, well, we can watch some films. His dad had rented or got hold of Alien and The Thing. And we watched The Thing first and Alien second. And to be honest, being sort of 15, I think Alien maybe suffered a little bit because we just watched The Thing. We should have done one at a time, but we're just taking our opportunity, really. And I can honestly say, we've been talking about some new things, but that afternoon changed my life because I'm still writing and talking about those films, ever since. But as we drove back to school to try and get away with it, and we did get away with it, to this day we weren't caught.
Wow.
In the kind of chaos of the sports day, we were just forgotten. We just talked about The Thing. We didn't talk as much about Alien. It's funny, when you do back-to-backs, often they can cancel each other out a little bit.
Yes.
I remember I did Gremlins and Ghostbusters on the same day, even at the cinema. And we saw Gremlins first, and we loved Gremlins so much more than Ghostbusters. Something about not giving the Ghostbusters enough time and space to have its own sort of place. So Alien is obviously very important to me, but The Thing was the film that just blew my mind on that day. Just clearly, like you say, Rob Bottin's visual effects, just something we'd never conceived of. And not just in terms of their visceral power, but their sort of narrative power, that they created this concept of this monster could be anything. It has carried all this DNA from space, from all the planets it may have been to. So there are no rules in terms of how it expresses itself. That idea, it feels defensive and panic. It just starts becoming numerous different things. Just fantastic visual idea and a fantastic way to do a movie monster. You absolutely strip away all the conventions in one go. And we were but also we loved Mac, we loved the setting, we loved the claustrophobia of it. So it was a really, one of those films that stayed with me and has continued with me.
Would you say that, because I would say this, and I'm sure you must feel the same, that ending where he didn't sugarcoat it, answer you a question, if you think about it, it's really freaking grim, but there's also kind of a little bit of a hope to it. And that music, that heartbeat, it's so powerful. You don't walk away like a lot of these Netflix and Amazon movies. You literally could watch the movie and you won't even know the title the next day. Can't remember it. But the way Carpenter ended that movie with the writing by Lancaster and the acting of those actors and the way it was shot, you don't walk away not thinking about it. It stays with you.
Incredibly courageous, not solve the riddle, to leave the audience unknowing. Extraordinarily powerful. The ambiguity, as a force in storytelling, something studios really can't deal with and can't cope with. And certainly Carpenter had to fight his corner to just finish it by going, they're going to die. It may be anyway. They've either saved mankind or they haven't. And if they have saved mankind, No one will ever know. But they'll never get the accolades. There's no heroic. They'll be just lost in time. That in itself is an incredible thought. Then there's this kind of idea that could one or the other one still be the creature? Could the creature have won the chess game after all? McCready loses the chess game at the beginning. That then troubles you. But the delicious sort of sense of not knowing and endlessly thinking about it is just extraordinary, I think, and just a brilliant gift. And it's a very hard thing to pull off because you can anger the audience. And I think in 82, I think Stuart Cohen says it in my documentary, he talks about the fact a lot of the things people love about the thing now, there's kind of wonderment about it. It's what's really going on. Where it was the things that people hated about it in 82. They wanted it all underlined, wanted a hero, they wanted to know the battle had been won. And in 82, they're all like, where's the rest of the movie? How can you stop now? So, but that's the genius of Carpenter, is to know what is right for a story, even if it isn't right, maybe a commercial win. I'm sure he wanted a commercial win, but he knew that this was the tough ending. But I don't think you could see another one. Yeah, it's inevitable, that ending. It has to be that way. And
add what you're saying. If you also add, you had these two alpha males, for the most part, that were always fighting each other at odds, almost on opposite sides. And then at the end, for them to kind of have they have a little bit of a laugh with each other. They've come to grips that they don't have to fight anymore, even though obviously they probably can't because they're so worn out. But there's something about that fact that Carpenter and Lancaster had the courage to let these guys kind of come to have a tough love. It's something I just rewatched The Grey the other 3 days ago with two friends. We had a horathon. We watched 3 horror films in one day, and The Grey was one of them. I know we spoke about that last weekend. One of the things I loved about that movie was all these guys fighting each other, and then at the end they all have this respect, and they have this, like, there's a tough love. And I love that about those two characters and The Thing. I think it's a great way to end it, besides the ambiguity, you don't know who's who, the mystery. There's something about that just all came together as one head. What do you think?
Absolutely. It is a film about masculinity. It is a film about men in obviously a tight-knit community, but about the potential for social breakdown, but also social cohesion, what holds us together. And what holds that group together is the fact that they have a mutual cause. They have to survive. And that's where Mac comes into his own. He becomes the guy that they know can potentially save them. And in a sense, all Mac wants to do is save his own, his own life. But it's interesting, like 1982, we got The Road Warrior. And The Road Warrior has that fantastically kind of, it's not as ambiguous, but he realizes that he's been a decoy. He finds the truck, the tanker is just full of sand. And he's cut to him and he just laughs. It's not a sort of particularly clear cut sort of ending, but it's so good. You kind of go, there's something about the human experience in that, that we're all unfulfilled, that life doesn't have movie endings. And I think Carpenter gets that, and I think George Miller got that. I think Ridley Scott eventually got that with Blade Runner. The ending he slotted in 82 was a bit forced, but the director's cut has shown us that needed an ambiguous ending as well. I just think it speaks to the human condition, that there aren't necessarily answers, that there isn't an end to the script, that there isn't that thing. And you can, I quite like David Fincher's The Game, but I only like it if I can think of the fact when he gets into the cab at the end, the game is carrying on. He's never escaped it. That's the only way. I can't get on with it having a happy ending. He's never going to get out of it. It's like Kafka. He's trapped in it forever, because that's life. And that we're all trapped in that kind of eternal sense of battle. So I think, in a way, the films of 82 really spoke to a kind of larger, more existential thing, well, sort of human nature was on display.
You said something a couple years ago when we did the Ridley Scott retrospect roundtable honoring his work. You mentioned that when you hear the music for Blade Runner, you feel like you're at home. I really feel that with The Thing, because The Thing changed my life to become a film director, and how high I hold. I think it's my opinion. If it's not it's one of the top 2 or 3 greatest films ever made, regardless of genre. It's one of the best films ever made, period. I just think that when I hear that music, whether it's Carpenter's music that he augmented or Morricone's music, I just feel right. Even though it's bleak, it's about the end of the civilization in the world, it makes me feel so damn good. I love The Thing. I mean, it's a big part of my life. How about you? When you hear that music, how does it make you feel?
It's something, a couple of people talk about it in the doc, that it's indelibly fixed with the film itself. You can't separate them almost in your head. It's the heartbeat of the creature. It's the dum dum. And it's kind of already it's sort of, it's a bit like Jaws in a way. It gives life the foe, presence to the foe, and especially with Cundy's sort of roving camera, which you've done in Halloween, but POV almost of The Thing. that it really is a way of sort of immersing you in the story, not just sort of, you're not here watching it happen over there, you're put into it. Yeah, it is a magnificent score in very different ways. The Morricone bits, Carpenter bits, the bits that kind of fused together. I don't care that, who did what. I think it just has that. In reality, they didn't film many whites. They shot second unit at the beginning of the whole production on the Juneau ice field, so Dog, the helicopter, and any helicopter shot back and forth was shot at the beginning. But all the rest of it was either on interiors or just the unit base in Alaska. And your head is already thinking about this vast Antarctic waste. I think a lot of that comes from the music. The music is a landscape as well within the film, but it sort of articulates there's no getting away from it. Beyond the last building is just nothing, and there's no running away. There's no, we're all trapped in. And I think it's just using film music in a way that it should be used. It's not decoration. It's there to become a presence within the story.
And you want to know something else that I want to say about Carpenter in particular, and obviously in this case The Thing, that I feel is a missing art form in today's filmmaking world. A lot of our filmmakers today, as much as I like them, are going over 2 hours long, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 3 hours, whether it's Scorsese doing it, Tarantino doing it, Wes Anderson doing it, all these other guys, Paul Thomas Anderson, all these guys are going there's something about Carpenter's economy.
Yeah.
The way he tells a story, whether it's Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, he keeps it under 2 hours. And I think that's a missing art form. I don't know if everyone's just so self-indulgent now, but I think that that's something I kind of yearn for as a filmmaker, even though I think my new movie is going to run 2 hours and 7 minutes. So I slightly go over the 2 hour mark. Don't you think that that's a quality to The Thing, that he kept it under 2?
Yeah, I mean, Carpenter worshipped Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks, was at its height in the golden era of Hollywood studio films, which rarely broke 90 minutes, let alone 2 hours. And you had to learn to tell your story within the confines of the studio set. And I think Carpenter thinks that's an important lesson. A film can't be too long, but a story can be too long. You can have certain films that work over 3 hours, and that's the experience. And you have certain films which are tight and measured. The point of The Thing is it happens very quickly. The events of the film is like 2 or 3 days in which it happens. You've got to communicate that to an audience. You can't have long, boring scenes where they talk about home and all this exposition. A waste of time. Carpenter says it in the documentary. Yeah, I don't care about that. It's just about what happens on the screen. Everything else sort of articulates backwards from that. So we understand a past by just what the characters do and how they do it. But absolutely, the leanness of Carpenter, the way he can fill his film with flourish and flair and great filmmaking, knows what the essential beats of the film is. And again, he talks about it on the documentary. Essentially, a lot of what you might think of as the story of The Thing happens off screen. A lot of the horror stuff we never see. When other people are taken, when Blair's taken, or when Norris is taken, it happens somewhere else to the film's strength, but actually quite unconventional. It's like in Halloween we saw the death. The Thing, it's only the kind of the cornered creature we see, the kind of expressions of the thingness. The actual, with the exception of Bennings, you don't really see a lot of it.
It's also interesting that you bring up with his simplicity, keeping things, kind of focused. Visually, as a director, myself, when I look at his approach with the camera, what's really interesting is a lot of these guys today will overshoot their movies. They're always got a cover, have all these different cuts, rapid fire editing. I call it attention deficit directing, which I think is a major problem on a Hollywood, even TV level. But with Carpenter, with that anamorphic frame, he lets the camera play out. He's got beautiful moves, but the moves aren't overly showy. You know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of one of my friends who's a guitar player kind of mentioned this to me, not technically, but when he said it, I didn't really get it at the time, but now I listen to it, I know what he means. It's like Randy Rhoads. When you listen to Randy Rhoads playing in the early Ozzy albums before he died, you would think he did all this intricate, wild stuff on guitar. When you listen to it, my friend said he's really simple. His playing is very simple. And when you listen to the stuff, he doesn't play like Eddie Van Halen or Yngwie Malmsteen or one of these guys. It's actually really simple, but it's so he like gets to the point. He does it really well. And that's the way Carpenter uses the camera. He's not overdoing it. He's letting those little moves go. He's letting the anamorphic 235:1 framework. And I think that's something to be said with directors today. I don't think I do it exactly like John does, but I take some of that quality. And I think that's part of his power.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think part of his mental makeup, his personality, is that he would say, why? Why do you need to do all these extra things? Have you not got it? Yeah, have you not got the shot? Clint Eastwood's quite similar to Carpenter in a sense. I think that Clint Eastwood got to make the Westerns and Carpenter never did. No, but they're both Western directors and they grew up on Westerns. And they understand that it's a very visual medium, but it's a steady camera. Camera should not intrude unless you're saying something very clearly with the camera moving. It's a language, and it's a language about landscape, and it's a language about how you tell a story within that landscape. And economy is really important. There is too much, as you say, there is far too much fussiness now. Scorsese can get away with it. He's doing tracking shots, but if I see another friggin' tracking shot, but unless I can see the narrative point, I just think this is indulgent. You're drawing me out of the film. You're either putting me in the film or you're pushing me away from the film. What's your choice here? So I watch a De Palma movie and I like the fireworks because that's the stories he tells.
Yeah.
I always think of De Palma as the great comic book director who never got a chance to make a comic book film.
Yeah, just like Carpenter not making a West.
Yeah, they just they had all the chops for these genres, but maybe they didn't want to. Yeah, so you go to a De Palma film and the split screens and anamorphics and all those kind of elements. But that's kind of how he tells his story. But I get a feeling with a lot of modern filmmakers, a lot of modern films, they're kind of built in the edit. They're not written properly. They're not even shot properly. They're kind of rescued in the edit with digital processes. And they just become sort of like treacly and layered with stuff in which you're just going, well, what do I care about? What am I meant to watch here?
And one of the big problems I have with that as an offshoot is that you don't know the filmmaker's signature. I'm not saying that but when you watch a Carpenter film through his music and his shooting, it's John. Same with Romero. It's Romero through the way he edits. He doesn't really move camera. And it's Cronenberg, De Palma. These guys all have a voice, a cinematic voice that's visually there. You could feel it. You could tell it. With all these other a lot of the directors today, you don't know who's who. You have no idea. You can't tell. You know what I mean? And I think that's a little bit of a problem because I like feeling those unique voices from Spielberg. He's got a voice.
Yeah.
I don't mean that you can't be diverse or flip your style. If you're just going to look like everybody else, what's the point?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of it. A troubling force within modern filmmaking is that given the digital sort of toolbox is now available, the studios can have a greater hand in and feel they can fix things a lot more. So it used to be a director did what he did because the studio couldn't do it. He was the only one who could go there and shoot and get the stuff and then put it together. And you kind of had to trust, and there were certain arguments. Now they can just go like Marvel. I'm not trying to dig at Marvel, but Marvel essentially edit the films without the director. The director kind of hangs around, but they insert all this stuff. And those films are made in post, and they are full of CGI, and every frame has got some kind of digital kind of trick to it. And I feel like it's catching flies in a bottle. It's just kind of like shaking it and it's things pinballing around. I think CGI can be incredible in the right hands, but it's just a tool. It's not, and filmmaking now relies on it to the point where they don't write scripts properly. They think, well, we've got to start shooting now. We've got a release date then. So, we'll just sort this out in post, and we'll shift that there and do that there. And God knows with AI, they'll now do performances in post.
Jeez.
I still think there is opportunity and there is a landscape where great filmmakers still do great work. I don't want to be totally negative about things, but it's a tricky time.
When I saw Aliens Expanded, I thought it was the best documentary I'd ever seen on a movie. And I've seen a lot of movies, documentaries on Laserdisc and TV and cable and VHS, etc. You really set a high standard. It was so well made. But now that I've seen The Thing, what amazed me about what you did first, and I'm not criticizing Aliens Expanded, I loved it. But what you did on The Thing, somehow, when you use title card, I'm not saying you, when documentary filmmakers, even filmmakers, use title cards, music, they have interviews, talking heads, footage from movies, there's a certain clunkiness that you can get doing that. And I'm not saying you did that even with Aliens Expanded, but somehow when you went from Aliens Expanded, which set this high mark for me, and you went to The Thing, which I've been watching over the last few days, it is so fluid. The way you go from the chapters and to who's talking and the music you chose, there's nothing that takes me out of that fluid motion. And that is incredible the way you do it. It's flawless. It's the best I've ever seen anybody ever do on a movie. And I'm not saying that because we're friends and I have high respect for you. When I'm watching it, I'm just astonished by how it's like water flows. And I've got to compliment you because that is not easy. I've never seen anybody do that better.
Well, thank you. It was a hard-won battle. That is the hardest battle of all, in a sense, to create the flow. Because we put, first of all, when you put your assembly together, and I'm sure you know this experience, you watch your assembly and it's just a bag of spanners. There's bits here and the music isn't done yet, and there's endless repetitions, and they're just like, people look weird, they've got really weird kind of, all that stuff hasn't been covered. But I should give immense credit to my editor, a guy called Samuel Way, who I work very closely with in the kind of process, who is incredibly, driven and a perfectionist to the point where he drives me mad. But that's what he should be doing. And he's really good on how to use the timeline, the importance of the timeline of the actual film, making sure that people sort of know where they are in terms of the thing. So the sort of sensibility you want with an expanded is the film is sort of playing in the background. It's on a screen somewhere, playing along, and we just draw away from it to talk about it, and then we go back to it. And of course, it plays in a much more extended time frame because the film will be over before we'll be able to finish it. That's kind of what's going on. And Sam is so good at sort of going, right, got to go back to the timeline. We've said all this, and quite often I wanted to say more on some subject. And the subjects, as you know, we get into, they can be simple as like Kurt Russell's sombrero, or the look of the Norwegian base and the kind of resonances of Vietnam, to how certain special effects sequences were pulled off. You can go quite a long way, and you can get really noodly on the many questions about, if you're the thing, do you know you're the thing? I loved all that stuff, and I would get quite wrapped up in it. But Sam would go, it's too long. We've got to go back to the timeline so people don't feel they're lost. And I think a lot of the fluidity comes from that kind of thinking, that sort of sense. Knowing your ins and outs on a certain piece. Knowing that you've got enough, and people have spoken about whatever the subject, casting. Knowing you've got enough and moving on.
I think it's a smart choice by him, and you'd agree with that, because you do have to, as much as me and you being film freaks, we would go to the bottom of the earth to find stuff. Maybe not everybody would. The fact you've got to kind of think of them, the viewer. Absolutely. But a 5-hour clip is still a pretty extensive clip, which I love.
Well, honestly, you got a 5-hour film. We do indulge ourselves. There's kind of an inherent law, I think, as well, is that if you say too much, you say less. You know what I mean? And it's always back to front. There was a point where it's a beautiful part of the process where you start taking things out and it gets better, and it seems to say more. You go, well, if you just remove that and that, and just let that Carpenter quote sort of live, then it just feels more, because there's almost space around John and you feel the emotion of it. That's a great feeling. There's another great feeling, because obviously the interviews are done across a large period of time, and Kurt was the last one we did, and I had quite a tight edit at that point, so I knew exactly where I needed to fit Kurt. And there's a lovely feeling of when I started to put Kurt in, it became a different documentary. It kind of got quicker because he brings energy, and it got funnier. Very important, as we talked about earlier. Humor is so important, and he just seemed to complete stories. The bus ride, the guys in the snow almost skidding off the road. We had that without Kurt, and it was okay. But when I got Kurt, he gave me that great line at the end. They knew they had their McCready at that point. And I did a screening of the thing. It wasn't completely finished, but we did a screening with an audience in London, and that got a round of applause when he said that. And people, they laughed, and they always went, yeah. And it was great for me, because I could hear the experience of the documentary is not necessarily all about information. It's about a kind of communication and hanging out with these guys, just sort of feeling that your passion is represented within the context of the doc. So, you are the perfect viewer in a way. You've grown up with the thing, you love the thing, you know it backwards in terms of the narrative, but you're endlessly curious, and I think you probably knew a lot of the things we talk about. But to hear a lot of different people talk about them, it is in itself a pleasure. I love those guys who worked with Bottin. We couldn't get Bottin. We tried really hard, but he does not want to come out of wherever he is. He doesn't want to be interviewed, and I accepted that, because I didn't want the documentary to be held back by that. It wasn't in search of Rob Bottin, it was about the thing. But I got the guys who worked with him, and I love Ken Diaz. He worked in it. He's one of my favourite interviews. And I just got a real sense of how young they were, what it was like in Bottin's kind of laboratory, that kind of like Universal Heartland, that unit, the chaos of it, the craziness of it, and the genius of it. That really thrilled me. to bring just their experience to life. And I don't know if you got that so much from previous Thing documentaries, just that kind of sense of memory and autobiography, that sort of sense of this is their story.
So a couple more maybe
Yeah.
sound superficial questions. Was there anyone else besides Bottin from the production that you were not able to get that you wanted to interview? I know obviously someone's passed that,
Yeah.
obviously there's no chance for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Was there anyone else you wanted that you couldn't get?
Mike Plug, who was the concept artist, we spent a lot of time talking to his friend who looks after us, and he's quite unwell, and we kind of played it, we kept saying, how is he, and they wanted it to work. There was a point where they said, Mike just can't be in front of the camera,
Wow.
I don't know what he's in his 80s now, and I would love to have spoken to Mike Plug because that concept art, he felt he sort of partly invented the creature. He helped develop the whole routine process. TK Carter, who died very sadly during production, we were in discussions with him for a long while, and I thought it was all coming together. I was going to do him at the same time as Kurt. So I was in LA to do Kurt, but I can do TK at the same time. That'd be great. But he passed before I got him, so that was a disappointment. In terms of people not in the production, I pushed very hard for Quentin Tarantino because he's a huge thing, as you're probably well aware, and I would have loved to. He didn't want to do it, or was too busy to do it. You don't get a lot of reasons. You just get told things.
Yes.
In terms of, I've been asked, who would you have loved to have spoken to who isn't with us anymore? And obviously I would love the other cast members, Donald Moffat and Wilfred Brimley. I'd love to have done Wilfred Brimley. But I really would have loved to speak to Bill Lancaster, the screenwriter.
Oh, yeah.
Because he would have had to have thought through so many of the questions that we ask of the film. Where is the creature at any point? When are certain people taken? Do you know, if you are the thing? And does that change bearing of the human or not? Has the creature got a plan? Is it sentient in that sense? Did it pilot the flying saucer? All stuff we throw into the dock and ask about. I think Lancaster would have really given a lot of details about the mechanics of telling that story, how you make that work. And so I would have loved to, if I had that, that time machine to go back and to do him.
This is a strange question, but I thought I'd ask it. On my movie I'm making now, Miss Scarlett, in post, I got to a scene that's about 3/4 into the movie. It's a pretty important scene. A lot of the movie hinges on it. And I remember when we shot it, it was my least favorite day. I'd lost my job the day before.
Right.
So and my birthday was the next day. So I was in between my birthday and losing a job. We shoot this scene.
Yeah.
And we were outside. It was really cold the whole day. When I got to that in editing to come up with my plan for that scene, I struggled with that scene. I didn't really want to choose it. I remember the feeling of doing it. It wasn't because it was done bad.
Yeah.
Just that day was very hard for me. Did you have any moments on this doc where you had any kind of a struggle, whether it was a creative idea, stuff you didn't have or wish you had? Did you struggle? Because I struggled with that scene about 3 weeks, and I never struggled that long on anything.
There's lots of that. There are lots of points where what you wanted to do, the story you wanted to tell, just didn't exist in terms of the quotes. I had plans for certain sort of areas we would study, and people didn't go with it, or they didn't understand it, and so you have to accept that that's not really going to work as that bit. I had an idea of doing a kind of digitalized timeline of the infection that would sort of show you in digital graphics where the creature was. It was sort of hypothetical, but would follow like a branching, when Blair's got, and it would sort of show you the kind of root of the creature. And essentially it shows you the narrative. I'd done diagrams and all these things. And I talked to my two different graphics guys, and I couldn't get them to understand me. I couldn't communicate. And I think the team was like that. They would go, how's it going? And they didn't really understand what I meant. And I think I got to a point where, if I can't communicate this to these guys, how am I going to communicate this in the film? This isn't working. And so I dropped it. In fact, it became the kind of intros to the sidebar elements, that corkboard effect.
Yeah.
A lot of it went into that, although that's just a vibe now rather than a proper thing. But that was my idea. So that and you feel those things. You feel the things that don't work. I mean, John communicates as John wants to, but he's a man of not many words. So I would have loved more from John. I think, on certain subjects. I really love Stuart Cohen because, he's the co-producer. I've spoken to you about his incredible memory. Stuart Cohen always sort of bolstered John. So John would start talking about something, this, and he was a stop, without, you think, is there more to that? Then Stuart would give me endless chat about it. So I could go, Start with John, carry on with Stuart. And in the viewer's head, kind of John is saying it all to you. You're not doing the kind of, you're just hearing the information. And it was a trick I started to get, I got clever about and using, and that's kind of documentary making. John is in every chapter and it's very emotional and very powerful at many times. But also he's not in it as much as you think because he doesn't say huge amounts. Cameron in Aliens says a lot and he's really throughout. But people are who they are. Walter Murch, the great editor of Apocalypse Now, he always says, your first job as an editor is not to think what's not there. It's not to remake the film, not to go, we haven't got this or we haven't got that. You've got what you've got, and then you figure it out. You can't turn the clock back. And he has a brilliant piece of advice. And so my editors sometimes wrestle with things. I hate this interview. Can we reshoot it? And I'm like, this is what we got. There are bits where you have to cover things, with clips because people have moved forward out of focus or camera person's lost them a little bit. And just as they're saying something really good, it happens. There's lots of those little, and you just have to find ways of covering that. So there is a lot of, smoke and mirrors that goes on that is filmmaking, that you do the best you can and then you sort of make it look better and make it feel better. But if you saw the assembly, you'll be like, what's this mess?
How long from beginning to end to make this? I know as a director, you're never really truly done with the movie
Oh
because you
yeah.
you not only you have to write it and finance it and cast it, crew it, shoot it, post production, then you have to sell it, market it, and then promote it. It's like never ending. It's like a director's job is never done. How long from like beginning of when you first start on it to where you are now would you say it's been on the thing?
So let's say we've just finished it. So literally last Friday, we're getting the final credits sorted. But there'll be Blu-ray checks to come and, that sort of stuff. But
Course.
essentially it's done. I started working on it, I think, in a serious sense in June 24. And we sort of officially went into production in August 24. John Carpenter was the first interview.
Wow.
So John Carpenter was the first, Kurt Russell was the last. It's kind of the bookends of it. What's that? Nearly 2 years.
Yeah.
2 years. It's coming up to 2 years. You're sort of in the edit from sort of I began putting it together around about beginning of 25.
Yep.
You just start trying sequences out. Process of documentary making is a little bit back to front in that you do lots of interviews and then you script from those interviews. So you script from footage you already have. So you go through the transcripts and you start going, I want a piece on the sombrero. So who's talked about the sombrero? And you start going, well, John first, then Stuart. And then when I finally got Kurt would go last because you're building up to Kurt.
Yep.
So you start doing those things where you start playing with stuff. And at some point, you're not playing with it anymore, and it is your assembly. You start slamming it all together, and then you get the music, and that sort of eases a lot of things. But the music was a tough journey for us. Chema Cabrio, my composer, he did a lot of music. It was a bit too sad. It was lovely music, but it was too negative in a strange way. And I had to get him to redo things. So, and he did a fantastic job. But it needed to be more uplifting because we were celebrating the film and we were sure of its qualities, even if history isn't. So you have to sort of put things. It's a journey. And this, and it's a lot of compromise. George Miller, the director, famously when he made Mad Max and hated it, his first film, he thought he'd made an absolute mess. And he went to his friend Peter Weir and he said, filmmaking is just a mess. Peter Weir goes, yeah, that's what it is. And he said, it's like walking a really large dog, huge dog down the street. And the dog wants to go somewhere different to you.
Yes.
You're constantly holding this dog to get it walking along the path you want it to walk. But it's got a scent and it wants to go off there. And that's what it is because a film will default into being terrible very easily. And it takes an enormous amount of will and concentration and emotional endurance and good voices around you, good people to bounce stuff off, taking criticism and learning to get to a place where you can be dragged away without, killing people.
What one of my friends told me recently about this movie that I'm going to be putting out, Miss Scarlett. He said to me, I give you my advice based on a situation he had with another friend. He said, you might think that your movie is this, but when it comes out to the audience, they may take it completely different. And no matter what they do, if it's something that they like, say they find it funny, and you thought it was supposed to be serious, but they took it as funny, as long as they enjoy it, don't fight it.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't force them to feel what they're going to feel about the movie. Let them enjoy it. As long as people enjoy it for whatever reason, it don't matter. So I'm trying to take that opinion, that approach before this movie comes out, that hopefully they just embrace it for some reason. And whatever
Yeah.
that reason is, it's okay. Because if you fight it, he told me he had this friend who had this film that he wanted to be a certain thing and it wasn't to the audience. And it kind of hurt him in some ways. He goes, don't let that happen to you. You know, they're going to think what they want.
Yeah.
Does that happen to you either on Aliens or
Yeah, I mean, I was saying, you get pleasant surprises in people laugh in ways you weren't expecting, and you can tell they're not laughing at it, they're laughing with it. Yeah,
with it?
I didn't expect either film to be as funny as people have taken them, and I didn't realize how, as a documentary maker, you're kind of thinking, I've got to be not serious, but you've got to be sort of convicted. You've got to have conviction in what you do, and you want to make it good. And sometimes humor can be, something you jettison. And it was so great to learn that it was a lot funnier than I expected, and people enjoy the humor. Both films surprised me in how fast they move. Because I work on it you work on it in bits. You work on certain bits for a long time and going back and forth on them, and when it gets put all together in your head, it's months long, because it's like you've been fiddling with it for so long, and then you play it, and even I was like, this rattles along, and it's 5 hours long. It is 5 hours long.
Yeah, it is.
And everyone who's seen it said that just went by in a flash, and you don't realize that, and it's to do with the editing and the pace. It's to do with the structure. This expanded structure has got this ability to, because you constantly know the film is there in your head, so you know where you are and you're moving along it. So I think that helps. But it's great to learn that they were pacier than I had expected them to be.
One last question, because I know we've been on a while. I know you must get fulfillment from both writing and directing a documentary. Now that you've done two, and obviously you've done 20 books and God knows how many reviews and magazines and such, which one do you get more pleasure from? Which one gives you more inside? And I know they're both a lot of work.
It's a difficult one. It's a little bit choosing between your children kind of story. But, a lot of it is about the feeling of you've got to the place, or near to the place you want it to be. That you are, that you've quieted that little voice of doubt in your head for the time being, and you never completely get rid of it, nor should you either, because I think it's important force. So I'm a little bit like certain books and both documentaries have given me that. Not all of them. I think The Thing Expanded has given me a great deal of that, probably more than Aliens, because I think Aliens was my first, and it was a bit more of a battle for me to sort of get it to work in my head. So I had to sort of learn things that weren't necessarily my instinct, because my instinct was as a writer was to be encyclopedic and detailed, and I had to learn to step back from that. So that was more of a battle with Aliens, so it was less satisfying. But I think there was a point halfway through The Thing that I was very pleased with how it was going, how it was, and I got confident at that point that I could swim about within it, that I knew it was all working, so I could go, let's do more on that and less on that. The big special effects sequences, the dog by the head and the blood test, and sort of Blair at the end as well. I kind of thought, I'm just going to give whole chapters to them. I'm just going to go for it, see what, indulge. And I knew from the beginning I was going to do the final chapter, obviously on the end of the film. But I edited it very early. It's one of the first I did. It's about the third or fourth chapter I actually completed. So I wanted an end point where I knew I was headed, with everyone. And I changed it a little bit as I got new interviews, and obviously you adapt. But John stayed at the beginning and the end of that chapter. And that was great, because I had a kind of an end place. I had a destination I was getting to. That also gave me confidence. So absolutely The Thing Expanded. But I've had books that have given me that experience as well. The Cameron book did, my Spielberg book I'm very proud of. Yes. I communicated something very personal in that. But all things are great, and I'm always, what's the most important thing to me? It's the next thing. Yeah. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's like that, isn't it? It's an it. What do I do now? And if I do the Terminator as my next one, if that works out, that's got to be better than The Thing Expanded. It's got to be, it's got to find something in it that's its own thing, but more exciting. But I feel I've got the tools now and the confidence to really go for that.
All I can say is that I think it's brilliant. I think that both your docs are absolutely fantastic. I can't recommend them high enough. And this is coming from a guy that's been making movies for 40 years, as you know. Yeah. And I just think if you're a fan of those movies, your appetite will be fulfilled. I think if you don't know about these movies, it's going to turn you on to something that now you're going to want to see. You probably should see the movie first so it doesn't ruin it for you.
They do. They've got quite a lot of spoilers in them, I say. if you haven't seen The Thing or Aliens, maybe watch the films first.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and then watch the films again afterwards.
Oh,
It's, yeah,
absolutely. And I did that even with your books. I'd read something in
yeah.
one of your books, go back and rewatch a Spielberg film or whatever. But yeah, I just think you're doing an amazing job.
Thank
I
you.
want to thank you as a filmmaker and as a film freak that you're satisfying this part of the world out there like we
Yeah.
are. I think you appeal to a bigger audience as well. I appreciate your time, Ian, and your friendship. And it's great to have you on the show here.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your interest and your encouragement. You were very encouraging, because
Thank you.
we do work on our own a little bit. We work in our own little bubbles, and you need to know, that people like what you do.